In a luxury restaurant where appearance seems to be worth more than character, an exhausted employee becomes the perfect target for a wealthy man accustomed to turning humiliation into entertainment. Convinced that money, arrogance, and a request in a foreign language are enough to crush someone he considers inferior, he decides to make that night a cruel spectacle in front of everyone. But behind the simple uniform exists a brilliant past, a silent pain, and an intelligence he would never imagine finding in the person he chose to despise. What begins as another attempt at public humiliation soon transforms into an unforgettable confrontation, capable of exposing masks, reversing positions, and changing destinies forever. Before hearing this story of pride, injustice, and a fitting response, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any twists. Le Jardin was located on a discreet corner of Rue Oscar Freire, with an avenue shaded by épée trees, and those passing by in cars hardly noticed the place's existence. That was how the owners wanted it. There was no luminous sign or flashy plaque, only a burnished brass plate with the name engraved in small, almost timid letters, as if the restaurant knew the right patrons would always find it. Inside, however, the environment was an exercise in calculated sophistication. Walls lined with ivory-colored boiserie, crystal chandeliers imported from Alsace, tables with Carrara marble tops, and dark blue velvet chairs that muffled the sound of movements. The place was expensive in its entirety, even the silence. Renata Sosa arrived that Tuesday night, 42 minutes ahead of her shift, as she always did. Not out of excessive discipline, but because the locker room was the only place in the day where she could sit in peace before putting on the shoes that had already slightly deformed her toes. They were black shoes, with a slightly rounded toe, bought 3 years ago at a sale in Brass. She had reinforced them sole by sole with cheap pharmacy insoles, and even so, at the end of each 6-hour shift, her heels protested with a discreet burning that she had learned to ignore. In front of the foggy mirror of the locker room, she tied her brown hair into a low bun and checked if her uniform was spotless. A white cotton shirt with a French collar, a black vest with silver buttons, an apron with the restaurant's name embroidered in gold at chest height. It was a beautiful outfit, she admitted, and that was exactly what bothered her. She felt like she was in costume. 3 years and 4 months ago, Renata had a different kind of badge. She was a researcher at the Department of Linguistics at USP, a scholarship holder with academic production that had caught the attention of a European foundation. She had published 2 articles in index journals, participated in a congress in Bordeaux, and was 6 months away from completing a thesis on phonological variations in Romance languages. Then her father had the stroke. It wasn't gradual. It was an August afternoon, the phone rang in the middle of a class, and when she hung up the call, she already knew the thesis would take a back seat for a while. What she didn't know at that moment was that that time would be indefinite. Her father, Seu Geraldo, a retired history teacher from a public school in Guarulhos, spent 3 weeks in the ICU and came out with motor and speech sequelae that required intensive physical therapy, speech therapy, regular consultations with a neurologist, and monthly medication costs that rivaled the rent of their apartment in Ipiranga. The research scholarship barely covered basic expenses before. After the stroke, it covered nothing. She requested a leave. The leave became an extension. The extension became a tacit termination. And then the vacancy at Le Jardin appeared, through a colleague who had worked there during her master's degree. The salary was good for industry standards, tips could be generous on the right nights, and the manager, a stern man named Mauricio, didn't ask questions about background as long as the person arrived on time and knew how to carry a tray without spilling. Renata learned fast. She had a facility with languages, which helped in a restaurant where the menu was written in French, and some of the customers preferred to place orders without translation. She had a precise memory for the preferences of regular customers. She had, above all, an almost supernatural ability to remain invisible when necessary, to transform her own presence into an efficient and discreet service that customers used without awareness that there was a person behind the apron. That night, as the hall gradually filled, she distributed the tables with the efficiency of someone who knows every inch of the space. Table 2 ordered the tasting menu. Table 7 changed the wine for the third time for no apparent reason. Table 12 was a Japanese couple traveling through Brazil who communicated with her in a surprisingly elegant French, to which she responded naturally, drawing a smile of genuine surprise from both. It was in these small moments that something inside her still pulsed, an intellectual satisfaction that had no easy name, and that she tried not to examine closely so as not to miss what she had left behind too much. That was when the restaurant door opened with more force than usual. It wasn't an aggressive bang, technically, but it had an intention in it, as if whoever pushed that door knew they were entering a place that belonged to them by tacit right. Rodrigo Vega crossed the hall with the posture of someone who had rehearsed his own entrance, his chin slightly raised, his shoulders broad under his Italian-cut grey suit, his dark hair pulled back with gel that shone under the crystal chandeliers. He was around 45 years old and carried an expression on his face that Renata recognized immediately. She had served that type before. It was the expression of someone who confuses the restaurant bill with the ownership of the entire environment. Behind him came a woman, Camilla, in a dark green dress, thin-heeled shoes, and an expression that fluctuated between discomfort and an attempt to conceal it. She was beautiful, with a groomed and expensive beauty, but there was something tense about her, as if she were following a script she hadn't written. Mauricio, the manager, received them personally and led them to table 8, one of the most privileged in the hall, near the window overlooking the avenue. It was Renata's table. She approached with her notepad and the professional smile she had cultivated over 3 years of practice. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome to Le Jardin. May I bring the wine list while you wait for the menu?" Rodrigo Vega looked at her for a moment too long. In that way, some people look at employees as if they were calculating how much it would cost to replace them. Then he diverted his gaze to the table, ran his finger across the marble top, and raised an eyebrow. "The glass is smudged," he said, without looking at Renata. She checked. The glass was impeccable. "I apologize," she said calmly. "I will replace it immediately." He didn't respond. He was already flipping through the menu as if the conversation were over. Camilla cast Renata a quick, almost apologetic look and looked away immediately after. Renata changed the glass, brought the wine list, and stepped back, waiting. This night was still at the beginning. On the other side of the hall, almost against the back wall, a gentleman with completely white hair occupied a table for 2 alone. He had a glass of mineral water in front of him and a small notebook open on the marble, although he didn't seem to be writing anything. He observed the environment with the silent attention of someone who spent a lifetime reading situations instead of participating in them. Renata noticed him briefly as she passed, as she noticed all customers in their first minutes. It was her method, a discreet scan of the environment to map temperaments and anticipate needs before they were verbalized. The gentleman with white hair ordered only water and a starter dish. He made no demands, did not raise his voice, and did not exist in an ostentatious way. He was the type of customer Renata appreciated without being able to explain why. Perhaps because on that night, between the tension already beginning to form at table 8 and the accumulated exhaustion of 5 consecutive shifts, there was something comforting about someone who was simply there, present and calm, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Le Jardin's wine list had 57 labels organized by region, and Renata knew them all. She knew which ones paired with each dish on the menu, she knew the vintages, she knew the producers, she knew the ideal serving temperature for each bottle. This knowledge had not come by chance. In her first months of work, she studied the list the same way she had studied historical grammar and comparative phonology, with discipline and marginal notes. It was what she knew how to do, transform information into competence. Rodrigo Vega flipped through the list with a haste that did not match the environment. His eyes slid across the pages without the attention of someone who really wants to choose, with the posture of someone who wants to be seen choosing. After a silence that seemed calculated, he pointed to a burgundy label and said, without looking up, "This one." It was a Gevry Chambertin of a recent vintage, a good wine, but not the best for what he intended to order as a main course. Renata observed the menu he had partially opened on the table and noticed he was leaning toward the rack of lamb with herb sauce, a combination that called for something more full-bodied, preferably a Côte du Rhône or a Châteauneuf du Pape. "With all due respect," she said carefully, "this Gevrey is elegant, but it might be a bit delicate for the rack of lamb. If you are considering the meat, we have a Châteauneuf du Pape that would pair better with the herbs in the sauce." Rodrigo Vega finally raised his eyes to her. It was a long, evaluative look, the type of look that scans a person from top to bottom without any modesty. "You understand wine," he said, with a tone that turned the phrase into a doubt. "I have been studying the list," she replied, maintaining the smile. He stared at her shoes for a second, a visible, intentional second. "Studied the list," he repeated as if the phrase were comical. Camilla beside him ran her fingers over her glass without saying anything, her eyes downcast. "I will bring the Gevrey Chambertin then," Renata said, taking a discreet step back. He let her go without responding, but when she returned with the bottle wrapped in a linen napkin and began the label presentation ritual, he interrupted before she finished. "It's taking too long." It was only 4 words, but the volume was calibrated so that the neighboring table would hear. Renata completed the ritual in silence, poured the tasting amount into the glass, and waited. He swirled the wine with a speed that did not allow for real analysis, smelled it briefly, drank, and made a dramatic pause. "It's acidic," he said. The wine was not acidic. It was a Pinot Noir of good provenance, with acidity within the parameters of the appellation, exactly what was expected of the region. Renata knew this. Mauricio, who observed from a distance with that capacity, good managers have to be everywhere without being noticed, also knew this. But in restaurants of that level, the customer was right even when they weren't. "I can bring another option if you prefer," she said. "I prefer that you don't bring me vinegar," he replied, and laughed briefly, looking at Camilla as if he expected her to join the joke. Camilla did not laugh. She picked up her water glass. Renata went to get a second bottle, this time the Côte du Rhône she had suggested at the beginning. When she returned and served it, Rodrigo Vega tasted it again with the same performative ceremony, and this time nodded, as if he were granting a favor to the wine. The dinner proceeded at that pace. He sent the amuse-bouche back saying it was cold. He asked for the light over the table to be adjusted twice. He commented, loud enough for the next table to hear, that the service seemed slower than the price suggested. With each interaction, there was an additional layer of pressure he deposited on Renata with the precision of someone who has practice in this. Camilla ate in silence, answering his questions with monosyllables, looking out the window at the avenue outside sometimes. There was a dynamic there that Renata recognized. She had seen it other times, the man who occupies the entire space, and the woman who learns to occupy as little as possible. It was during the main course that the situation changed register. Rodrigo Vega leaned back in his chair with the posture of someone about to enjoy himself. He looked at Renata with a different expression, sharper than the previous ones, and when he spoke, he did so in French. It wasn't the polite French of a tourist, nor the functional French of an executive with frequent trips to Paris. It was a French with deliberately rebuscade constructions, mixing archaic vocabulary with expressions that belonged more to 18th century literature than to everyday use. A performance. He was saying that the service had been mediocre, that the waitress clearly did not belong in that environment, and that he hoped at least the dessert would be better than the experience so far. He said all this smiling, looking at Camilla out of the corner of his eye, waiting for embarrassment to settle on the face of the waitress, who, he assumed, had no idea what was being said. Renata listened until the end. There was a moment in situations like this when a choice presented itself. It was possible to smile vaguely and pretend not to have understood. It was possible to withdraw under the pretext of taking the order. It was possible to do what the environment expected her to do, disappear efficiently. But there was another possibility. She took a deep breath, an almost imperceptible breath, and responded in French. Not in the French of someone who studied through an app, nor in the French of someone who spent a summer in Paris. In the French she had absorbed over 7 years of research in Romance linguistics, through conferences, readings of primary texts, and a 3-week stay in Lyon during an academic exchange funded by the very foundation that would later consider her candidacy for a scholarship. It was a living, precise French with the correct musicality of nasal vowels and the natural cadence of someone who thinks in that language before speaking it. She said with the same tranquility with which she would take a dessert order that she had understood every word of what he had said, that the service had not been mediocre, just honest, which was sometimes confused with mediocrity by those who expected adulation instead of competence. She added, moving to a slightly more formal register, that the expression he had used to describe the environment was grammatically incorrect, that the participe passé required gender agreement in that context, and that, if he wished, she could clarify the rule after service, at no additional cost. And then she turned to the table and asked, in Portuguese and with a completely natural voice, if they would like to see the dessert menu. The room had stopped. It wasn't a planned silence, nor a coordinated collective reaction. It was the type of silence that happens when something unexpected breaks the background noise of an environment and people realize, even before processing what they heard, that something has changed in nature. The couple at the next table had their forks suspended. The younger waiter, passing by with a tray, involuntarily slowed his pace. Even Mauricio, from his discreet post near the kitchen entrance, tilted his neck slightly toward table 8. Rodrigo Vega had the face of someone who has just stepped on a stair that didn't exist. His mouth was half open. The wine glass was in his hand, forgotten. He looked at Renata as if she had done something that violated an unwritten rule, but one absolutely established in his worldview, the rule that certain people do not talk back. Camilla, for her part, looked at the tablecloth with her lips pressed together. She was clearly trying not to laugh, and she wasn't succeeding very well. In the 3 years she worked at Le Jardin, Renata had learned to calibrate her own silence. There was the silence of waiting, the one she maintained between presenting the dish and retreating discreetly, giving space for the customer to try it before any comment. There was the silence of restraint, the one she used when a customer said something offensive and she needed 2 or 3 seconds to rephrase a response that was both honest and within the restaurant's protocol. And there was a third type of silence, rarer, the one she used when she had said exactly what needed to be said, and there was nothing more to add. It was this third silence she was practicing now, as she waited, notepad in hand, for Rodrigo Vega's response about the dessert menu. He took his time. That was unusual. That type of man rarely took time for anything because delay implies hesitation, and hesitation implies that there is something in front of you that does not yield to your rhythm. But he was taking his time. He ran his tongue over his teeth, looked briefly at Camilla as if seeking some guidance she did not offer, and then returned his eyes to Renata, with an expression she recognized as the second phase of an irritation that had not yet found its definitive form. "What is your background?" he said. It was a question asked as if it were a minor accusation. "Linguistics," she replied, with the same naturalness as if she had stated the house specialty. "Linguistics," he repeated, and there was in this repetition the same disdainful quality he had used before with the wine list. "So, you studied to serve tables." Renata stayed quiet for a second. Around them, the hall had resumed its murmur, but there was something in the quality of movement of nearby people that suggested attention was still present, a type of peripheral listening people practice when they don't want to seem curious but cannot completely disconnect. "I studied to research," she said. "I am serving tables in the meantime." "In the meantime," he repeated, and this time the smile returned, but it was a different smile from the previous one. It was the smile of someone who just found where to press. "It must be hard, this in the meantime." Camilla placed her water glass back on the table with a touch firmer than necessary. He didn't notice, or noticed and ignored. Renata did not respond to the provocation. There was a line she had mentally drawn since her first month of work at Le Jardin, a line between what was professionalism and what was capitulation. Responding to the French had been professionalism, because feigned misunderstanding would have been a form of lie, and she had difficulty with lies, even convenient ones. But entering a discussion about her own life choices, there, in that context, with that man, was something different. It was what he wanted, and she wasn't going to offer it. "I can suggest the tarte tatin with bourbon vanilla ice cream," she said, "or the fondant au chocolat, which is the house specialty on Tuesdays." He observed her for another second, as if testing if her silence was weakness or firmness. Then he ordered the fondant without further comment. Camilla ordered the same, and as Renata walked away, she heard, softly, Camilla say something she couldn't quite distinguish. Rodrigo responded in an equally low voice, with a tone that didn't sound good. In the kitchen, as she entered the order into the system, Renata stood still for a moment with her fingers over the keyboard. Her heart beat at a rhythm slightly different from normal. Not from fear, she knew the difference, but from that kind of discreet adrenaline that accompanies moments when one chooses not to yield. It was a feeling she had forgotten a bit during the last 3 years. The daily routine of the profession demanded a form of erasure so constant that sometimes she forgot there was a type of resistance that didn't need shouting or confrontation. It was enough not to pretend. She returned to the table with the fondant 15 minutes later. The chocolate was at the exact point, the ice cream perfectly tempered, the presentation impeccable as always. She placed the plates carefully, asked if they needed anything else, and was preparing to retreat when Rodrigo Vega lightly pushed the plate back. "It's burnt," he said. Renata looked at the fondant. It wasn't burnt. It was perfect, with the shell slightly crunchy and the interior still fluid, exactly as the executive chef had specified. She knew that texture. She had served hundreds of that same dish. "The liquid center is the characteristic of the fondant," she said carefully. "It is not a preparation failure. It is the technique." He looked at her from bottom to top. "Are you telling me that I am wrong?" "I am explaining the technique," she said. "You may return it if you prefer, without any problem." He leaned his body slightly forward, and when he spoke his voice was lower, more direct, with a quality different from the previous ironies. "Do you know what I think? I think you have an attitude problem for someone in your position." Camilla diverted her gaze to the window. Outside, the IP trees swaying in the March breeze projected moving shadows on the sidewalk, damp with mist. The avenue was almost empty at that hour. A couple walked slowly on the other side of the street, indifferent to what was happening inside the illuminated restaurant. Renata kept her face neutral, but inside her, something had become absolutely quiet, like the specific quality of silence that precedes a decision. She didn't know yet what would come next that night, but she knew with a clarity that had nothing intellectual about it that she had reached a point of no return at that table. "I will check with the chef," she said, and walked away with measured and uniform steps without haste and without hesitation. In the kitchen, the executive chef, a man from Recife named Henrique, who had interned in Lyon and returned to Brazil with European technique and a northeastern temperament, heard Renata's report with the expression of someone who had already been through that. He was a tall man with large hands and a calm voice, with the type of authority that doesn't need to be declared because it is present in every movement. "The fondant was perfect," he said, without looking up from the pan. "I know," she replied. "Do you want me to send another?" She thought for a moment. Sending another would be capitulating, and the new dish would be rejected for another invented reason, because the problem at that table wasn't the fondant. The problem was something else entirely, but refusing the exchange would give the man a justification to escalate the conflict in a way that would harm her, not him. "Send it," she said, "with an extra scoop of ice cream." Henrique raised an eyebrow and then discreetly smiled. It was the type of response he understood, not as weakness but as a strategic choice. Serving well was not the same as submitting. Sometimes it was exactly the opposite. She returned to the hall with the second fondant and deposited it before Rodrigo Vega without comment. He looked at the plate, then at her, then at the plate again. The additional scoop of ice cream was there, a deliberate excess that was both generous and completely ironic, for those who knew how to read it. Camilla saw it and her eyes shone briefly with something like appreciation. Rodrigo said nothing. He picked up the spoon and began to eat. For a few minutes, table 8 was in relative peace. Renata served other tables, checked orders. exchanged 2 words in a low voice with the younger waiter about the state of table 12. Gradually, the tension that had settled in GU part of the hall seemed to dissipate, like mist that the wind carries away without warning. But the mist hadn't gone away, it had only changed shape. The bill arrived at 10:40 p.m. It was the most delicate moment of any dinner at Le Jardin because there the service was concluded and the customer no longer needed anything, which meant that any new conflict would be created, not motivated. Renata placed the leather bill holder on the table with the same care she had used to serve each dish, stepped back, and waited. Rodrigo Vega opened the bill holder, looked at the values, closed it again. He took a card out of his wallet, a black card with embossed characters, the type that certain people carry more as a statement than as a payment instrument, and deposited it on the leather without saying anything. Renata took the bill holder and went to the terminal. She processed the payment, which was approved without any incident, printed the receipt, and returned to the table with the slip. As she approached, she noticed that Rodrigo Vega was standing, his jacket adjusted, his shirt cuffs pulled out of his sleeves with that gesture some men use to indicate that the night, from their perspective, had ended. Camilla was also standing, her bag hanging on her forearm, her face with an expression Renata classified in that second as relief. Renata deposited the bill holder with the slip on the table and took a step back. It was then that Rodrigo Vega touched his own jacket, a quick gesture of verification, the type of movement people make automatically when getting up in public places, checking documents, phone, wallet. His hand went to the outer pocket of the jacket, then to the inner one, and then stopped. Renata saw the change in real time, the change in his face, the slight contraction around the eyes, the hardening of the lip line, the way his shoulders moved forward for a fraction of a second before he composed himself. "My card," he said. The tone was different from everything he had used so far. It wasn't irony, it wasn't condescension, it was something more calculated. "You just used it to pay the bill," Renata said carefully. "It's in the bill holder with the receipt." He opened the bill holder. He took the receipt, checked it, and looked at her again. "It's not this one. I have 2 cards. The other card, the one that was in my jacket pocket." Renata stayed absolutely quiet. Internally, something seized up, not from guilt because she knew precisely what she had done and what she hadn't done that night, but from recognition. She had seen that change in his face, had recognized the calculation behind it, and now she knew what was coming. "I did not touch your jacket," she said, with a firm and low voice. He looked at her for a long second and then, without raising his voice but in a way that the volume carried through the acoustics of the marble and velvet hall, said, "You stayed near this table all night, and my card disappeared." The silence that settled was different from the previous one. The one before had been of surprise, almost admiration. This one was tense, uncomfortable, the type of silence people avoid by looking at their plates. Mauricio crossed the hall in less than 10 seconds. He had a neutral face, with the visible effort of someone who maintains neutrality as a work tool. "Can I help, Mr. Vega?" Rodrigo Vega turned to the manager without taking his eyes off Renata. "Your employee took my card." The sentence was simple, direct, and completely devoid of evidence. But in the context of a luxury restaurant, spoken by a man with the suit he wore and the tone he employed, it had a weight that Renata felt physically, like pressure on her chest. "I can check the cameras," Mauricio said, still with that professional neutrality. "I want her searched now," Rodrigo said, with more volume this time. "I want her to empty her pockets here in front of everyone." Camilla took a step to the side as if she needed space. Her expression had changed. The previous relief had given way to something more anguished. Renata looked at Mauricio. There was in this look a silent communication the two had built in 3 years of working together, a language of gestures and expressions that replaced words in situations where words would be inconvenient. What she was saying was, "I didn't do this." What he read in her, she knew, was the same thing he always read, an employee who had never given cause for suspicion. But there was another language at play in that room, the language of economic power and social visibility, and in that specific language, Rodrigo Vega spoke much louder. The accusation was false. Renata knew that. Mauricio probably knew that. But there was a practical and immediate problem. Proving a negative, especially when the accuser has the posture of someone who has already decided the verdict before the trial, is not simple or fast, and every minute of hesitation seemed, to the hall watching, a confirmation. Renata put her hand in her apron pocket, empty besides the notepad and a pen. She opened the other pocket, the same. She raised her eyes to Rodrigo Vega with the composure of someone facing a lie without lowering herself to its height. "I do not have your card," she said. At that exact moment, from the distant table by the wall, the gentleman with white hair who had spent the night in discreet silence rose slowly from his chair. He did not hurry. There was a calm deliberation in his movements that drew more attention than any haste. He was a man of about 70, of medium height, in a simple classic-cut suit, without ostentatious adornments. There was no detail about him that screamed wealth, but there was something in the way he moved that made people look, without knowing exactly why. He walked to table 8 with the calmness of someone who has every right to be anywhere they choose to be. "Excuse me," he said. The voice was deep, moderate, with the precise diction of someone who spent decades being heard with attention. Rodrigo Vega turned around. There was an initial irritation on his face at the interruption, the expression of someone who doesn't like to be interrupted under any circumstances, and even less at a moment like that. But before he could say anything, the gentleman continued. "I have been sitting in this room since 8 o'clock. I followed all the service at this table with considerable attention, and I can state with absolute certainty that this young lady did not touch your jacket at any point tonight." The quality of the silence in the hall changed again. It was the third different silence of that night, and this one had a specific texture, the texture of when a scale that was tilted to one side begins, slowly, to move. Rodrigo Vega looked at the gentleman with an evaluative expression. "And who are you?" The gentleman did not answer the question immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward Rodrigo's jacket. "I suggest you check the inner pocket," he said. "The left one, specifically." There was an authority in this suggestion that was neither aggressive nor condescending. It was simply the authority of someone who knows what they are saying. Rodrigo stood still for a second. Then, with slightly tense movements, he placed his hand in the inner left pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out a black card with embossed characters, the same card that, according to him, had disappeared. Camila closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, looking at the ceiling as if seeking patience at some point above her head. Mauricio maintained his neutral face with visibly greater effort. Renata said nothing. There was nothing to say that silence itself was not saying with much more eloquence. Rodrigo Vega held the card in his open hand, and the entire hall understood at that moment what had happened. The sequence was clear. A man had been unmasked by the waitress he tried to humiliate, his ego had been wounded, and he had invented an accusation to destroy the only job she had. It was a small revenge, disguised as indignation, dismantled by a gentleman who chose not to stay quiet. The mask had fallen, and what remained under it was exactly what Renata had suspected since the first supposedly smudged glass, a man who only knew how to exist when he diminished others. But the night had not yet ended, and the white-haired gentleman had not yet said who he was. The white-haired gentleman's name was Armando Figueiredo. He didn't say it immediately. First, he waited for Rodrigo Vega to put the card back in his wallet with the mechanical movements of someone still processing what had happened, and only then did he answer the question that had been hanging in the air since he stood up from the table. "Armando Figueiredo," he said, with the simplicity of someone used to having their own name do the work for them. The silence that followed was of a different quality. It wasn't the silence of surprise from the previous episodes. It was the silence of recognition, the one that happens when a name that exists in very specific layers of a certain world is spoken aloud in front of people who inhabit that world. Mauricio recognized the name first, and the change in his expression was subtle, but visible to those who knew how to read faces with attention. Renata didn't recognize it immediately, because the name Armando Figueiredo didn't circulate in linguistics departments nor on academic conference agendas, but Rodrigo Vega recognized it. The recognition crossed Rodrigo's face like a wave that comes from the depths and only reaches the surface after a delay that says everything about the depth from which it started. First the slight contraction around the eyes, then the reorganization of the shoulders, which lost their previous broad angle and found a slightly more defensive position. Finally, the rereading of the entire situation, which was visible in the way his gaze quickly scanned the gentleman in front of him, reinterpreting every detail he had previously dismissed as irrelevant. The simple suit, the quiet hands, the lone table, the open notebook, the entire night of observant silence. Armando Figueiredo was the founder and president of the Figueiredo Group, an investment and financial services conglomerate, with a presence in 11 states and stakes in 3 of the country's largest private banks. It was the type of power that doesn't need ostentation because it is embedded in the structures beneath everyone else's ostentation. He was, among other things, one of the main creditors of at least 2 of the investment funds that supported Rodrigo Vega's business group. This specific detail, Renata would only know later. For now, what she saw was a man who had arrived at Le Jardin as an ordinary customer and who now, standing in the middle of the hall, had changed the weight of the entire situation with just a name. There was something disturbing and at the same time absolutely coherent about it. Real power rarely arrived with fanfare. It arrived like this, silent, observant, present all night before revealing itself. Rodrigo Vega tried to compose himself. It was a visible and not very successful attempt. "Dr. Figueiredo," he said, with a tone that had changed registers so suddenly it sounded mechanical. "I didn't know you were here tonight." "I rarely announce it," Armando Figueiredo replied serenely. "I prefer to see things as they are." The sentence was simple, but in the context of everything that had happened at that table that night, it had the weight of a verdict. Rodrigo made an attempt to smile, the type of smile people use when they are trying to turn a defeat into an ambiguous situation. "A misunderstanding with the card," he said. "Easy to happen at the end of a dinner." Armando Figueiredo did not respond to that. He turned slightly to Renata and looked at her with a different attention than he had dedicated to her during the night. It was a direct attention, without the layer of discretion he had maintained before. There was something in this look that she couldn't classify immediately. It wasn't pity, it wasn't simple admiration. It was more like recognition, the kind that happens when someone sees in another person something they identify as real. "You handled the situation with remarkable composure," he said. "Thank you," said Renata, and there was in her voice a firmness that was neither pride nor defiance, just the presence of someone who receives just recognition without needing to diminish it. Camilla grabbed her bag with both arms against her chest, in a gesture that seemed to contain both the desire to leave and the need to watch the end of it. She looked at Rodrigo with an expression that had solidified throughout the night, moving from discomfort to something more definitive at that moment. Rodrigo noticed her look, and something in his posture changed once more. The recomposition he had tried a moment ago was fraying at the edges. He was a man accustomed to leaving every situation with the position he had entered, and that night had challenged that habit in every possible direction. "I'll call for the car," Camilla said in a low voice, and walked toward the exit without waiting for an answer. Rodrigo stood still for a second, alone in the center of the hall, the card back in his wallet, and the weight of a night that had gone completely differently from what he had planned. Then he adjusted his jacket, nodded in an indefinite direction, and left. The hall breathed. Armando Figueiredo stayed where he was, standing, and looked at Renata with that same direct attention. "May I ask a question?" he said. "Of course," she replied. "Your last name is Sousa, Renata Sousa. You published an article on phonological variation in Iberian languages in a European journal about 5 years ago. It wasn't a question. It was a statement made with the care of a question to give her the choice of confirming or not." Renata stayed absolutely quiet. "Yes," she said after a second. "It was me." Armando Figueiredo nodded, in a way that seemed to confirm something he already knew but needed to verify. Your work was submitted for the Lacroix Scholarship Selection in 2021, he said. The foundation I manage has a seat on the selection board of that scholarship. You were considered. You reached the final stage. And then you withdrew your candidacy without any explanation. Renata felt the floor of the hall seemed slightly less solid than it was. It wasn't a feeling of weakness. It was the type of vertigo that happens when something you had carefully kept in a closed compartment of memory is named aloud by another person, in a place you would never have expected. My father had a stroke, she said. I needed to step away. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the same serene voice as before, I understand. I am sorry for what happened. And there was something in the way he said it that was different from protocol sympathy. It was a short sentence said by someone who knew the weight of what was being described and didn't try to dry it with extra words. The hall had resumed its normal operation. The conversations at the other tables returned to their usual volume. Mauricio had discreetly withdrawn to the kitchen entrance. The younger waiter was replacing glasses on one of the illuminated shelves at the back. It was as if the night had taken a long pause and now decided to continue without drama, as if the interval were normal. But for Renata, that section of the hall was still standing still. She looked at Armando Figueiredo and tried to organize the internal questions that were coming too fast to be formulated properly. Why he knew her name. Why he had associated that article with a waitress in a restaurant in the Jardins. What that meant. Did you recognize me tonight? She asked carefully. Not immediately, he said. When you responded to Mr. Vega's French, there was a very specific refinement there, a quality of language use that is not learned in a course. I began to observe more closely, and then, when you mentioned you were a linguist, something became clear. Renata processed this in silence. May I make you a proposal? Armando Figueiredo said. And there was in the question a genuine courtesy, not the ornamental courtesy of someone accustomed to giving orders wrapped in kindness, but the courtesy of someone who understands they are entering ground that belongs to another person and truly asks for passage. She looked at him. She was 34 years old, had worn shoes and an overdue speech therapy bill in her wallet. She also had an article published in an indexed journal, 7 years of research, stored on an external hard drive inside a box under her bed in the apartment in Ipiranga, and the exact memory of what it was like to wake up in the morning with a research problem in her head, that specific form of intellectual hunger that nothing else fed the same way. You can speak, she said. Armando Figueiredo's proposal did not arrive that night in the form of a definitive offer. It arrived as an invitation for a conversation, which Renata realized later was the way men of that type operated when they were being genuinely serious. When they are not being serious, they make proposals. When they are, they invite for conversations. He left a card on the table, a simple card without a job title described, just the name and a phone number, and said she could call when it was convenient, without haste. He paid the bill without asking for the bill holder, simply communicating to the younger waiter that he was covering his table, and withdrew with the same discretion with which he had spent the entire night there. Renata stood with the card in her hand for almost a minute, standing in the same place in the hall, while the movement of the restaurant continued around her, with the natural indifference of things that have already fulfilled their function. Mauricio approached after the last customers were leaving. Are you okay? He asked. I am, she said. And it was true, as far as it was possible to be okay after that specific night. He stayed quiet for a second. Then he said with that pragmatism Renata had learned to appreciate in him over the years, Rodrigo Vega has been a customer for 2 years. He won't be back, not after this. It wasn't a declaration of explicit solidarity. It was information, but there was in it everything Mauricio was capable of offering in the emotional register, and Renata understood. Thank you, she said. He nodded and returned to his duties. She closed the shift half an hour later, put away her apron, put her coat on over her uniform, and left through the service door that led to the side avenue. The March air was humid and slightly cold, and the IPA trees swayed slowly without apparent wind, as if they were settling in for the night. On the subway back to Ipiranga, with Armando Figueiredo's card in her coat pocket, Renata stood in an almost empty car and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. It was a partial reflection, fragmented by the tunnel lights passing quickly outside, and there was something in it she couldn't name exactly, but that was different from the reflection of all previous nights. It wasn't hope. She had learned to be careful with hope, because hope without structure is just another way to prepare for disappointment. It was something more like a tension, like the feeling that there was an open space ahead that didn't yet have a defined shape, but was real. At home, the apartment was in the specific silence of weekday dawns, the low hum of the old refrigerator, the smell of medicine that had settled permanently on the sofa cushion where her father sometimes slept. The light from his room filtered through the crack in the door. She passed the crack carefully and saw that he was sleeping, his breathing regular, his hand on the blanket. Seo Giraldo had been a man of easy speech and frequent laughter before the stroke. He was that type of teacher students remember decades later, not for the rigors of exams, but for the way he brought history into everyday situations, how he found connections between the distant past and what was in the bus window. After the stroke, speech had become difficult, slow, as if words needed an enormous effort to cross a distance that was previously non-existent. He communicated with her through expressions and gestures, and sometimes with words that arrived incomplete, but arrived. She had learned to complete the sentences carefully, not in a way that silenced him, but in a way that he knew he was being understood. She closed the crack gently and went to her room. She opened the closet, and in a gesture she hadn't planned, took out of a shoebox the external hard drive where the thesis files were. She held it in her hand for a moment. It was light, that object, less than 100 grams, but what was inside it had the weight of 7 years of work, of dawns in the library, of a congress in Bordeaux where she had presented a paper and received praise from researchers whose names she knew before she knew their faces. She put it back in the box. It wasn't yet the moment to open those files, but there was something different about that gesture of putting it away. It was different from all the previous times she had put it away. This time, she knew where it was. The next morning, after serving coffee to her father and doing the morning physical therapy exercises that had become part of the house's rhythm, she took Armando Figueiredo's card from the coat pocket she had left hanging on the chair. She stayed looking at it on the kitchen table, between the coffee cup and the medicine packages lined up by time. She thought of her father sleeping in the room next door. She thought of the speech therapy bills piled in the kitchen drawer. She thought of the external hard drive inside the shoebox, of those files stopped in time like a clock that stopped at the exact moment of a rupture. She thought for a second of the previous night, with a clarity that seemed almost unreal in the morning light. The illuminated hall, the silence of crystal, the voice of the white-haired gentleman cutting through the air with an authority that needed no effort. There was an obvious risk in that phone call. Not the risk that Armando Figueiredo was ill-intentioned. She had read people for long enough to have some confidence in that reading. The risk was different. It was the risk that the conversation would be good, that the proposal would be real, and that she would then need to face the question she had pushed away for the last 3 years. What she actually wanted from her own life. Not what was possible, not what was practical, not what sustained the rent and the medicines. What she wanted. It was a dangerous question to ask when one had learned to function without answering it. So she picked up the phone and dialed the number. They answered on the second ring. "Renata Sousa," she said. "You invited me to talk." The voice on the other side sounded with the same serenity as the night before. "Good morning, Renata. Thank you for calling. I have a free slot tomorrow at 10 in the morning, if that's convenient for you." It was convenient. She only had a shift at Le Jardin at night. "I'll be there," she said. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a moment. From the room came her father's voice, slow and incomplete as always, calling for her. She stood up, left the card on the table and went. Seo Giraldo was sitting on the edge of the bed, already awake, his white hair messy on one side. He looked at her when she entered and tried to say something. The words came partially, the first syllable of her name coming out firm and the second stumbling, but arriving. It had been like this for months. The speech therapist said there was progress, that neuroplasticity worked at its own pace, and that there was reason to be patient. Renata had learned to be. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed and held his hand. It was a large hand, that of a teacher who had spent years holding chalk and pointing at maps on walls, now slightly trembling but still warm. "I have a meeting tomorrow," she said carefully, as if testing the weight of the words aloud for the first time. "It might be something important." He looked at her. There was in his eyes an intelligence the stroke had not touched. He understood everything. The difficulty was only in the output, not the input. He lightly squeezed her hand and nodded his head, slowly. It was enough. Armando Figueiredo's office was on the 32nd floor of a building on Faria Lima, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the entire city. São Paulo spread out below with that messy grandiosity that was its mark, a horizon of concrete and glass punctuated by green where the parks survived. Renata arrived 5 minutes before 10. She wore a dark crepe blouse and tailored pants, bought for an interview that had led to nothing, kept since then as a piece waiting for the right occasion. The receptionist accompanied her to the room without excessive ceremony. Armando Figueiredo was standing by the window when she entered, his back to the door looking at the city. He turned upon hearing the footsteps, extended his hand, and greeted her with the same tone of voice as the night before. Calm, direct, without the performative cordiality Renata had learned to detect and distrust. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Sit down, please." There was a small meeting table in a corner with 4 chairs and a thin folder on the marble. He sat on the other side and she on hers, and for a moment both were in silence without haste to fill it. "I'll be direct," said Armando Figueiredo. "I prefer it that way." "I prefer it too," she replied. "The Figueiredo Group has maintained a cultural foundation since 1998. We work with the preservation and study of linguistic and documentary heritage, manuscripts, historical archives, collections of languages at risk. We have partnerships with Brazilian and European universities, and we have had a vacancy open for 6 months that I haven't been able to fill the way I needed." He opened the folder and placed a job description sheet on the table. Renata read it slowly, line by line, with the same attention she had read her first academic texts in undergrad. Collection and linguistic research coordinator, management of documentary collections, supervision of cataloging projects, articulation with external researchers, institutional representation at national and international events. It was a position she might have reached in a normal trajectory after completing a doctorate and a few years of post-doc. In a normal trajectory. "Why me?" she asked, without drama in the question. It was a legitimate question, and she needed the answer. Armando Figueiredo leaned his body slightly forward. "Because you published an article that 3 researchers on our board cited in their own works. Because you were selected for the final stage of the Lacroix Scholarship on merit, not by referral, and because last night you maintained a composure that was not passivity and a firmness that was not aggression. That is rare." Renata was silent for a moment, not because she didn't know what to say, but because there was an amount of information and emotion there that needed a second to organize. "My father needs continuous care," she said. "I cannot accept anything that compromises that." "I understand," he said. "The position is in person but with flexible hours. The starting salary is described on the last page of the folder, and there is an additional detail I want to mention." He made a brief pause. "The Foundation has an agreement with the São Paulo Neurological Rehabilitation Institute in Vila Mariana. It is one of the best rehabilitation institutions in the country. Part of our partnership agreement includes spots for family members of employees. If your father qualifies clinically, which I believe he would, we could arrange the transfer." Renata looked at the city outside through the window. São Paulo in the morning had a different light than the São Paulo of the dawn she returned to by subway. It was a light that came from the side, horizontal, hitting the glass surfaces of the buildings and multiplying into reflections that made the city, for a few minutes, almost beautiful, in a way she rarely stopped to notice. She turned her eyes to the last page of the folder. The salary was more than double what she earned at Le Jardin, combining shift and tips. "I need some time to think," she said. "Of course," said Armando Figueiredo, "but not much time. The vacancy needs to be filled by the end of the month." She nodded. She tucked the folder under her arm when he offered it for her to take, stood up, and extended her hand. His handshake was firm, without being demonstrative, the kind that ends a conversation without ending the subject. On the way out, waiting for the elevator in the silent corridor, she stood with the folder against her chest and looked at her own reflection in the polished surface of the closed elevator doors. It was a clear reflection this time, without the fragments of the subway glass at midnight. She saw her own face clearly, the dark crepe blouse, the tailored pants that had waited for the right occasion, the leather shoes that still had breath left. The elevator arrived. She entered. And for the first time in 3 years and 4 months, the weight she carried on her shoulders had a different shape. It was still there, but there was something in it that wasn't just exhaustion. It was also possibility. And possibility, she had forgotten, also weighs, but in another way entirely. That same afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open and a cup of coffee cooling beside it, Renata read the job description 3 times. Not because she hadn't understood on the first reading, but because there was a difference between understanding what was written and letting it truly land as something that belonged to her concrete life. Seo Geraldo was in the living room armchair with the radio on low. He liked the radio more than television. He said radio required imagination. Renata looked at him from a distance, he who didn't yet know what had happened, existing within the limits of the apartment with the dignity of someone who accepts circumstances without dissolving in them. She stood up, crossed the room, and sat on the arm of the chair beside him. They had done this for years, since before the stroke, meeting in that same chair at the end of the day to talk about things that weren't urgent. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something." He turned off the radio with a slow hand and looked at her with total attention. That was what the stroke had not touched, the quality of his attention. When he looked at someone, he really looked. She told him about the night at Le Jardin, the arrogant man, the French, the false accusation, the white-haired gentleman, the card in the jacket pocket, and the morning meeting, the folder, the position, the agreement with the Rehabilitation Institute. She told it without dramatizing or minimizing. When she finished, Seo Geraldo was silent for a moment. Then he made a visible effort, his forehead slightly furrowed with concentration, and said one word. Only one, incomplete in the second syllable but unmistakable. Accept. Renata felt something release inside her chest, not in a dramatic way. It was like when a knot that had been tight for so long you forget it was tight is loosened, and relief arrives not as euphoria, but as space. She took 2 days to call back. Not because she was in doubt, but because she wanted to be sure the decision came from a firm place, not from immediate relief. When she called, she said she accepted and had questions about the start logistics and about the father's evaluation process for the institute. He answered each question objectively. On her last day of work at Le Jardin, Renata arrived earlier than usual. She put away the gold-embroidered apron, folded it on the locker room counter and looked at it for a moment. 3 years and 4 months of shifts, worn shoes, professional silence cultivated as a tool, a stored French that had waited, patient, for the right night. Mauricio hugged her briefly in the corridor, completely out of character for him, which she knew how to recognize as the emotional equivalent of a long speech. Henrique came out of the kitchen to shake hands. The younger waiter said he would miss her. She walked out the front door for the first time. The avenue of EP trees was lit by cast-iron lampposts, and the yellow flowers of March dotted the dark canopies. She walked to the corner, breathed the night air of the Jardins, and turned toward the subway with a step different from all previous ones on that sidewalk. No longer rushed, no longer heavy, just present. The Figueiredo Foundation occupied the 4th floor of a renovated townhouse on Rua Bella Sintra, 2 blocks from Oscar Freire, in a curious neighborhood that mixed designer boutiques with art galleries and antiquarian bookstores. The building had been the residence of a wealthy São Paulo family at the beginning of the 20th century, and the renovation had preserved the high ceilings, the stucco moldings on the ceiling, and the sash windows with dark green painted wooden shutters. Inside, the space combined that historical architecture with discreet and functional work furniture, floor-to-ceiling shelves in every room, and the permanent smell of old paper that Renata recognized on the first morning as the specific smell of intellectual happiness. She started on a Monday in April, 3 weeks after the night at Le Jardin. The team was small and specialized. A trained archivist, 2 external researchers who worked as consultants, an administrative assistant named Vera, who had spent 15 years in that same place and knew where every document was in every drawer of every archive. And there was also, arriving 3 times a week from a room on the 3rd floor, the project director, Dr. Helena Casado, a 60-year-old woman with closely cropped hair, thin-rimmed glasses, and the type of direct intelligence that dispenses with prefaces. Helena shook Renata's hand on the first day, with the efficiency of someone who has already formed an opinion and doesn't need more time to confirm it. "I heard you have good French," she said. "Reasonable," Renata replied. Helena smiled briefly. "In linguistics, reasonable means fluent. Welcome." In the first few days, Renata learned the collection. They were collections that took decades to be understood in their totality, 18th-century manuscripts from religious orders that had operated in the interior of colonial Brazil, diplomatic correspondence in archaic Portuguese, field materials from anthropologists who had documented indigenous languages before many of them went extinct. There was an amount of silent history there that she touched with gloved hands and felt as responsibility, not in the oppressive sense of weight, but in the living sense of someone who understands they are facing something that matters. At the end of the 2nd week, Helena called her for a meeting. "We have a project that's been stalled for 8 months, she said, a collection of letters in medieval Catalan on loan from a university in Barcelona. No one here has the necessary training for paleographic analysis, and the return deadline is in September." Renata looked at the photos of the letters laid out on the table. "I can try," she said. Helena looked at her with that direct attention. "I don't need a try. I need a result." "Then I can deliver a result," said Renata, and that's how it happened. Not with fanfare, not with a dramatic and unique turning point, but with the silent accumulation of days when she arrived early, worked with her hands and head, left at the right time to be home when the caregiver changed shifts, and returned the next day. It was real difficult work, with the specific quality of things that demand the best of you without asking you to lose yourself in the process. On weeknights, back at the Ipiranga apartment, she had dinner with her father and told him about the Catalan letters, about the manuscripts, about the idiomatic expressions that appeared in colonial texts and had no direct equivalent in any modern language. He listened with that total attention that was his mark, and sometimes asked questions with the words that arrived, incomplete but precise, pointing to historical connections she hadn't thought of alone. It was in these moments that she remembered why she had chosen linguistics, not for the index journals or the European congresses, for the possibility of a conversation in which language was both the object and the tool, in which talking about words was also a way of being present with another person. Her father was transferred to the São Paulo Neurological Rehabilitation Institute at the end of April. In the first week, the speech therapist communicated to Renata that there was reason for moderate optimism with the intensive protocol available there. Renata knew how to read what was beneath that sentence and took it home as if it were a fragile treasure. It was on a Thursday in June that Camilla walked through the Foundation's door. Renata was at the large archive table when she heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up. The woman in the green dress from that night was there, in simple clothes this time, a blouse and beige linen pants, without the tension that had marked her every move at Le Jardin. She seemed different outside that context. She seemed simply herself. "I'm looking for Renata Sousa," Camilla said to Vera. "That's me," said Renata, standing up. Camilla looked at her for a moment. There was something there that wasn't exactly guilt, but was close enough to guilt for Renata to recognize it. "I wanted to apologize personally," said Camilla, "for what happened that night. I should have said something much sooner." Renata was silent for a moment, and then made the only gesture that seemed correct. She pointed to the chair in front of her. "Sit down," she said. "I can ask for a coffee." Camilla sat. The two were silent for a moment, the type of silence that isn't uncomfortable because both people know what's inside it. "I knew he had made it up," said Camilla in a low voice. "When he put his hand in his pocket before accusing you, I saw the gesture. He does that when he's looking for a way out. I had seen it other times." Renata said nothing. She left the space open. "I should have spoken before," Camilla continued. "I was paralyzed. It's a very specific thing when you spend enough time beside someone like that, the paralysis. You know it's wrong, but the habit of yielding is faster than the decision not to yield." "I understand," said Renata, and it was true. There was a mechanics to it that she recognized, not from the same situation, but from the same principle, the habit of becoming small in the presence of pressure that does not deserve the space it occupies. Camilla looked at the table, at the archive gloves, at the carefully arranged documents. "You like it here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Very much," said Renata. Camilla nodded, and there was in this nod something that was relief. Not relief from forgiveness, which Renata had neither formally given nor denied, but relief at seeing that the person she had failed was okay. That the world had reorganized itself in a reasonable way, despite what had happened that night. They had coffee. They talked for 40 minutes, not about Rodrigo Vega, whose name did not appear again, but about other things. The work with the manuscripts, Camilla's research in molecular biology, which genuinely surprised Renata. There was a woman there who had also been shaped by the presence of someone who occupied the entire space, and who was in the process of reclaiming her own. When Camilla left, Vera appeared at the archive door with an expression of discreet curiosity that was the equivalent in her of a direct question. "An acquaintance," said Renata, and returned to the Catalan letters. But she stayed for a moment with her eyes on the page without reading, thinking that that visit had something that completed an equation that had remained open since the night at Le Jardin. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a dramatic closure. It was just the recognition that the people who pass through the periphery of a difficult situation also carry its weight in ways that are rarely seen. That afternoon, before leaving, she sent a short message to Armando Figueiredo. It wasn't a professional update, it was just, "Thank you." He replied 3 hours later, "The work speaks for you. Continue." She put away her phone, turned off the archive light, and went down the stairs of the townhouse on Bella Sintra. São Paulo was still awake outside, as always, but there was something different in the way she heard that noise that afternoon. There was a small gap between her and the world, enough to breathe, enough to think, enough to be, in a complete way, the person she had been before, and who, with work and a bit of courage on a Tuesday night, had decided to continue being. 6 months after the night at Le Jardin, on a Saturday in September with that dry and luminous cold that São Paulo offers when it's in a good mood, Renata arrived at the Institute at visiting time with a book under her arm and 2 cheese breads in a paper bag she had bought at the corner bakery, because they were her father's favorites since before everything. The rehabilitation room had a wide window that caught the afternoon sun, and Seu Geraldo was sitting in the chair by the window with the newspaper open on his lap, although Renata knew reading was still difficult. He held the newspaper the way he had always held it, with both thumbs in the center fold, as if the gesture itself were already a form of reading. When she entered, he looked up, and he said her name. Complete. Both syllables, following one after the other without a stumble, with the exact musicality she had kept in her memory during 3 years and 4 months of incomplete sentences and words that arrived halfway. There was no urgency in the way he said it, nor excessive force, no visible effort. It was just her name said by him, as it had always been. Renata stood still in the doorway for a second that lasted longer than a second. Then she entered, pulled up the chair beside him, placed the book on the table, and opened the bag of cheese breads between them. And they stayed there, father and daughter, in the September sun with the city outside and the open newspaper, and the smell of warm cheese bread, and the wide window, and her name still in the air, whole, without losing a single letter. Renata thought at that moment of the night at Le Jardin, of the hall lit by crystal and marble, of the man who had arrived as if the place were his, and left as what he was, of the worn shoes she had replaced, not because someone ordered it, but because the moment had come, of the French that had waited for the right night inside her, with a patience she hadn't deliberately taught, only preserved. Of Armando Figueiredo, who had been there all night before it was necessary. Of Camila, sitting before the coffee at the foundation with the posture of someone learning to occupy her own space. Of Mauricio, who had folded professional distance into a quick hug that said more than any written reference. She thought of all this, and then stopped thinking because her father was beside her, and the sun hit the newspaper from the side, and there was still warm cheese bread, and there was time, real time, the kind counted not in urgencies, but in presence. She had learned in those 6 months that the stories that change a life rarely have the format one expected. They don't arrive with warning or with the dramatic weight that would make them easier to recognize at the moment they happen. They arrive on an ordinary Tuesday in a restaurant hall, through a man who chooses the wrong person to humiliate, and through a response that comes out not by calculated courage, but by a simple refusal to pretend she doesn't understand what she understands perfectly. True class, she had always known this, but had needed a specific night to feel the real weight of the thing, is not in the name of the wine or the language in which the order is made. It is not in the size of the suit or the height of the office floor. It is in how you treat those who seem to have no power at all. It is in who you are when no one you want to impress is looking. And it is, sometimes, in knowing that the person beside you, who carried the apron and the worn shoes and the external hard drive with the thesis inside the shoebox, always knew it. They just needed space to exist entirely. The September sun moved slowly through the window, as it does, and they stayed there, the two of them, in a silence that needed no more words. Dear audience, if the story of Renata and Seu Geraldo touched something in you, know that it was made exactly for that, to remind you that dignity cannot be bought, and that stored knowledge never stops belonging to those who built it. We have many other stories like this waiting for you here on the channel, stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary situations with the only tool no one can take from anyone: character. If you've made it this far, you've already proven you have the right taste. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of real life. Leave your like, because it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be heard by more people. And tell us in the comments, what was the moment of this story that stayed with you? Until the next story, we are here. End of story.